In today's episode, we'll be sharing some chilling basement horror stories that probably will give you some chills. But before we begin, consider giving us a like. It helps a lot. And if you've got a true horror story of your own, send it to me, and I'll probably add it to a future video. It was the fall semester of my senior year, and like most students on campus, I was juggling classes, internships, and social obligations. That's when I met him. We were both at a political rally, a fairly common scene at my university. He approached me during one of the smaller breakout discussions, introducing himself with an easy smile and a confident tone. At first, he seemed friendly, but something about his demeanor felt off. His eye contact lingered a little too long. His laughter seemed forced. Still, I brushed off the discomfort, attributing it to my overthinking. As the rally wrapped up, he struck up another conversation, casually suggesting we grab coffee sometime. I hesitated, unsure if I really wanted to, but I didn't want to seem rude. "Sure, why not?" I said, giving him my number before heading back to my dorm. A few days later, he texted to set up a date. We met at a campus cafe, and while the conversation was polite, it felt one-sided. He dominated the discussion, his tone sometimes verging on condescending, as though he was performing rather than connecting. By the end of the coffee date, I knew I wasn't interested. I left feeling relieved it was over, but I also didn't want to deal with the awkwardness of cutting ties completely. Instead, I kept the interaction polite but distant, hoping he'd lose interest on his own. Weeks passed, and I didn't hear much from him. I assumed whatever interest he had was gone, and I was glad for the space. Then one night, my sister hosted a house party, inviting friends and acquaintances from campus. Feeling relaxed and in good spirits, I decided to send out a few additional invites, including one to him. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, more out of politeness than genuine desire to see him. When he texted to say he couldn't make it, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The party was already lively, and I didn't want to deal with the awkwardness of his presence. As the night went on, most guests began to filter out, leaving only a small group of close friends and my sister's roommates. We were starting to clean up when there was a knock at the door. It was him. My stomach dropped when I saw him standing there, casually holding a six-pack of beer like he was right on time. His unannounced arrival caught me off guard, and while I tried to mask my unease, I could feel the tension creep into the room. The party was clearly winding down, yet he seemed oblivious, or worse, indifferent, to the fact that his presence wasn't welcome. He stayed, taking up space on the couch as though he belonged there, laughing too loudly and inserting himself into conversations that were no longer relevant. My attempts to signal that the night was over went ignored, and I could feel my frustration and discomfort building. Still, I didn't know how to confront him directly, so I avoided eye contact and tried to stay in the background, hoping he'd take the hint. But he didn't leave. By the time everyone else had either left or gone to bed, it was well past midnight. The house had settled into an awkward silence, but he stayed, sprawled out on the couch in the living room like it was his own space. My sister and I exchanged uneasy glances. We didn't want to escalate things, but it was clear that he wasn't taking any cues to leave. Since there was nowhere else for him to sleep, and I wanted to avoid further interaction, my sister suggested he could crash on the couch upstairs. I reluctantly agreed, silently hoping that he would sleep it off and leave in the morning without further incident. Exhausted and still uncomfortable, I grabbed my blanket and pillow and headed down to the basement, where a few of us had set up makeshift sleeping arrangements. The basement was cold and dark, but it felt safer being out of his immediate proximity. I tried to relax, wrapping myself tightly in my blanket and listening to the soft murmurs of my sister and a couple of her friends nearby. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, the tension of the evening fading into the quiet of the night. I woke up abruptly, a jolt of pain shooting through my face. Disoriented, I blinked in confusion and realized I was staring at his figure looming over me. Before I could react, I felt the sharp sting of his foot connecting with my cheek. He had kicked me in the face. Frozen in shock, I couldn't comprehend what was happening. He didn't say a word. He didn't shout or explain himself. He just stood there for a moment, his expression unreadable, before silently turning and retreating up the basement stairs. I lay there, trembling, my heart racing as I tried to process what had just happened. The fear paralyzed me. Should I follow him? Should I wake the others? My mind raced through every possibility, but the thought of confronting him filled me with dread. What if he became violent again? What if this time it was worse? I stayed where I was, clutching the blanket tightly, my breath shallow and uneven. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The sunlight filtering through the basement window was a small comfort, but it didn't erase the terror I'd felt during the night. I stayed in the basement until I was sure he had woken up and moved to the kitchen. My sister, noticing the tension in my face, asked what had happened. When I told her, she immediately stormed upstairs to confront him. I stayed behind, still too shaken to face him directly, but I could hear her voice rising, sharp and angry. "You need to leave, now!" she shouted. He didn't argue or defend himself. Instead, he casually gathered his things and walked out the door as if nothing had happened. The casualness of his departure left me even more unsettled. It was as though he didn't think twice about what he'd done or the fear he'd caused. The audacity of his behavior was chilling, and it left me questioning how someone could act with such calm indifference after such a disturbing act. Later that day, he texted me as if nothing had happened. "Hey, how are you?" The message read, like we were friends catching up after a normal evening. Disgusted, I immediately blocked him, my hands shaking as I stared at my phone. Even now, years later, the memory lingers. I'll never understand what motivated his actions that night, and maybe it's better that way. But one thing is certain, I'll never dismiss my instincts again. The summer of 2010 was one of those endless, sun-soaked vacations I spent traveling with my family. That year, we stopped at a peculiar hotel somewhere off the beaten path. From the moment we arrived, I couldn't shake the feeling that the place was different. Its architecture seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. Long, winding hallways led to nowhere, and the stairwells didn't seem to match up with the floors. My parents dismissed my comments as typical teenage dramatics, but something about the hotel didn't sit right with me. Even the staff seemed distant, their polite smiles never quite reaching their eyes. Still, it was just a stopover for the night, and my family treated it like any other leg of our road trip. We settled into our room, unpacked a few essentials, and prepared for a low-key evening. But I couldn't sit still. The odd layout of the hotel intrigued me, and my curiosity got the better of me. While my parents and siblings busied themselves with television and board games, I decided to explore. I told them I'd be back soon, ignoring their half-hearted warnings not to wander too far. The hallways seemed even stranger once I was alone. Some were well lit and carpeted, while others were dim and lined with scuffed, unmarked doors. I wandered aimlessly, feeling more and more like I was in a maze. Finally, I spotted a stairwell and decided to climb, hoping to find a rooftop view or at least a clearer sense of direction. The stairwell was narrow and cold, its metal railing smooth and cool under my hand. As I climbed, the air grew heavier and the lighting dimmed. I glanced back down occasionally, but each turn of the stairs seemed to blur together, disorienting me further. When I reached a landing, I pushed open the heavy door, expecting to find another hallway, or maybe even the top floor. Instead, I stepped into what looked like a basement. The air was colder here, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered weakly. Rows of storage boxes and unused furniture were stacked haphazardly along the walls, casting long shadows that stretched toward me like reaching hands. I hesitated, realizing I had gone much farther than I intended. Turning back seemed like the logical choice, but something about the basement drew me in. I walked cautiously, scanning for an exit sign or anything that might lead me back to familiar territory. The only sound was the echo of my footsteps, which seemed louder in the oppressive silence. Then I saw him. A man stepped out from behind a stack of boxes, startling me so badly that I froze. He was tall, wearing a white lab coat that seemed out of place in the dimly lit storage room. His face was expressionless, his eyes focused on me with an unsettling intensity. "Are you lost?" he asked. his voice calm but hollow. I nodded, too nervous to speak. Something about him didn't feel right, but I was desperate to find my way out. "I know the way," he said, gesturing for me to follow him. Without waiting for my response, he turned and began walking deeper into the basement. Despite the knot of unease forming in my stomach, I hesitated only briefly before following. I told myself he was a staff member or some kind of maintenance worker. Surely he wouldn't lead me anywhere dangerous. But with each step, the storage area grew darker and more isolated, and I started to feel like I had made a terrible mistake. The further we went, the darker and colder the basement became. The weak fluorescent lights gave way to dim, sporadic bulbs that cast unsettling shadows on the walls. My footsteps slowed as the knot in my stomach tightened. The stacks of boxes and discarded furniture became fewer, replaced by bare concrete walls that seemed to close in on us. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The man didn't answer right away. He kept walking, his lab coat swaying slightly with each step. When he finally spoke, his tone was flat, almost rehearsed. "The exit is just ahead. Stay close." Something about his words, or perhaps his lack of eye contact, sent alarm bells ringing in my head. This wasn't right. He was leading me deeper into the basement, farther from where I'd started, and every instinct screamed at me to turn back. "I think I can find my way out from here," I said, stopping in my tracks. My voice echoed faintly in the empty space. He turned to face me, his movements slow and deliberate. His expression remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes, a flash of frustration or perhaps something darker, that made my breath hitch. "You can't stop here," he said, his voice sharper now. "Come on." I shook my head, taking a step backward. "No, I'm going back." He took a step toward me, his calm demeanor cracking. "You don't want to do that," he muttered, his tone carrying an edge of menace. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I opened my mouth and screamed. The sound of my own voice startled me, reverberating through the empty basement like a shockwave. For a moment, the man froze, his eyes narrowing as if weighing his next move. Then his expression twisted into anger, and he took another step forward, his pace quickening. "Stop it," he barked, but I screamed again, louder this time, hoping someone, anyone, would hear me. Just as he closed the gap between us, a new voice cut through the tension. "Hey, what's going on here?" I turned toward the sound and saw a janitor standing at the far end of the hallway, holding a mop in one hand and a bucket in the other. His eyes darted between me and the man, his face a mix of confusion and concern. The man in the lab coat stepped back, his expression shifting once again. "It's fine," he said quickly, raising his hands in a show of false innocence. "Just a misunderstanding." The janitor didn't look convinced. "This kid doesn't look fine," he said, his voice firm. He motioned for me to come over, and I didn't hesitate. I ran to his side, my heart pounding as he placed himself between me and the man. "I'm calling security," the janitor announced, his hand already reaching for the walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. The man in the lab coat opened his mouth to protest, but stopped short. His face darkened, and without another word, he turned and walked briskly down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows. The janitor stayed by my side until hotel security arrived, their flashlights cutting through the dim basement as they searched for the man. Despite their efforts, he was nowhere to be found. One of the officers escorted me back to the main floor, where my frantic family was waiting. I threw myself into my mother's arms, trembling as I recounted the events. The hotel staff downplayed the situation, insisting the man was likely a trespasser who had slipped in unnoticed. They apologized profusely and assured us they'd review the security footage and tighten their protocols. But their reassurances did little to ease my lingering fear. Later that evening, as I tried to calm down, I overheard my father speaking with one of the security officers. "We didn't find any evidence of him working here," the officer said quietly, "and that part of the basement has been closed off for years." The weight of his words sent a fresh wave of unease through me. Who was that man? Why was he there? And what would have happened if the janitor hadn't intervened? When I was 7, our family decided to rent out the basement of our house. It seemed like a simple, practical decision. The basement was large but unfinished, and we didn't use it for much beyond storage. My parents thought renting it out to a young couple would be a good way to bring in some extra money while putting the space to use. The couple who moved in seemed nice enough. They were young, probably in their early 20s, and had an easygoing vibe that made them approachable. The man, tall and lanky with a ready smile, always greeted us warmly. His girlfriend, a petite woman with long dark hair, was quieter but equally kind. They never made us feel unwelcome and even let my siblings and me come down to their space on occasion. As a kid, their basement was a treasure trove of curiosity. They had a small collection of movies, some video games, and even a dartboard, things we didn't have upstairs. They'd let us play with their stuff if we asked, treating us like younger siblings. At the time, it felt exciting to have these cool tenants in our house. My parents, too, seemed to appreciate their friendliness, though I now recognize the occasional hesitation in my mother's smile when she interacted with them. For the first few months, everything seemed fine. The couple kept to themselves for the most part, and their occasional parties didn't bother my parents too much. But over time, the disturbances began to escalate. The parties became more frequent and rowdier, with unfamiliar cars parked in our driveway at odd hours. The loud music and muffled voices often kept us awake at night, and my parents' patience began to wear thin. One evening, my mother came upstairs looking visibly upset after retrieving laundry from the shared area near the basement. She wouldn't tell us exactly what she saw, but her tone was sharp as she told us we weren't allowed to go downstairs anymore unless one of our parents was with us. My dad began locking the door that connected the basement to the main house, something he'd never done before. Things came to a head when my parents discovered drugs in the basement. I didn't understand much at the time, but I remember the tension in the air and the hushed arguments between my parents as they debated what to do. The final straw came after a particularly disruptive night when the police were nearly called. My parents decided the couple had to go. When my dad told them they needed to move out, the man tried to argue, his easygoing smile replaced with a defensive edge. But ultimately, they packed their things and left without much fanfare. I remember watching them drive away and feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. They'd been kind to us kids, but even I could sense that something about them wasn't quite right. After the couple moved out, the house felt quieter, almost too quiet. My parents reclaimed the basement, scrubbing it clean of the mess they'd left behind. My siblings and I weren't allowed to help, but I remember sneaking a peek through the door as my parents carried up bags of garbage and boxes of things they insisted were better off thrown away. My mother muttered about strange smells and stains that wouldn't come out, and my father spent an entire weekend repairing a hole in one of the basement walls. I didn't ask many questions. I could tell from their tense expressions that it wasn't something they wanted to explain. As time passed, the couple became a distant memory. We grew older, the basement was renovated into a rec room, and our lives returned to normal. Occasionally, I would think back on them, particularly the man with his carefree smile and the girlfriend who rarely spoke but always seemed kind. To me, they were just part of my childhood, an odd but mostly harmless chapter in our family's history. Years later, during a family gathering, a revelation shattered the benign memories I had of that time. My uncle, who worked in corrections, brought up an inmate he had encountered recently, a man who shared the same name as the male tenant who had lived in our basement. My father, overhearing, went pale. "Wait," my father said, leaning in. "You're talking about him?" "Yeah," my uncle replied, his voice low. "It's bad. He and his father were arrested for murder. Brutal stuff." The words hit me like a punch. My mind flashed back to the basement, to his easy smile and the times he let us watch movies or play games. It didn't make sense. How could someone so seemingly kind have done something so horrific? My uncle went on to describe the crime in vague but chilling terms. The man and his father had been involved in a violent dispute that escalated into murder. The details were murky, but the outcome was clear. They were both serving lengthy prison sentences, and the man we once knew would likely never walk free again. The revelation left me rattled for weeks. I kept thinking back to all the times my siblings and I had gone down to the basement, completely unaware of the danger that could have been lurking so close. I remembered how the man would invite us in with a friendly wave, how we'd laugh and play with his things, never suspecting what he might have been capable of. My parents were just as shaken, though they tried not to show it. My mother, in particular, seemed haunted by the idea that they had let someone like that into our home, into our lives.